Mitt Romney's political comeback is in full swing. The 2012 Republican presidential nominee won a landslide victory in Utah's GOP Senate primary on Tuesday. I caught up with Romney in the wake of his win this week, and I started out by asking him why, at a time when so many Republicans seem to be leaving Washington, he wants to go.
Well, I think these are times that call for people of sober judgment. I hope I fit that qualification. And I think it's a critical time. I think we're going into a turbulence internationally of significance. And I think domestically, our economy is going to get turned on its head by virtue of artificial intelligence and automation. And I think you need to have people in Washington who understand how the economy works. And I think I'm one of those.
You mentioned foreign policy in the world. In 2012, you called Russia our greatest geopolitical foe.
This is to Russia. This is, without question, our #1 geopolitical foe.
Do you still think that's the case, and do you feel a little bit vindicated?
Well, there's no question they've acted like a geopolitical foe. They've backed some of the world's worst actors. They've invaded neighboring nations. And, of course, they've interfered with democracies and electoral processes, not only in the U.S., but around the world. But they're not alone. There are other geopolitical adversaries. That doesn't mean we're ever going to be in a kinetic conflict with them or with other major nations like China. But China is also becoming a bit of a geopolitical competitor, if you will, if that's a better word. In that they're pushing against our interests in various parts of the world. And you've got these authoritarian regimes who want to denigrate democracy and the nature of our republic and substitute a form of authoritarianism. Do
you have any advice for President Trump when he meets with Vladimir Putin? His national security advisor is in Russia right now planning that meeting.
You know, I don't know that I offer advice to the president on meeting with Vladimir Putin. I think that we as a nation and as our leaders have to recognize that their interest is to weaken democracies like our own. And as if you will, the leader of the free world, they want to see us in particular be weakened. And so pushing back against them and holding a strong hand always makes sense.
Do you think Putin is an enemy of the United States?
Well, I think he sees us as a competitor and an adversary, if you will, in a geopolitical sense. We're not going to go to war with Russia, hopefully never, and likewise with other major nations. But his interests are very different than our interests, and his interest is to play a greater and greater dominant role to oppress people and nations around his nation, former Soviet states. And that is not something which is acceptable to people who value freedom.
Do you think the Russia investigation is a hoax?
No, I think it's a totally appropriate evaluation by our government. Russia's clearly trying to become involved in the electoral process here and distort that process. We need to find out how and where, punish the people who have potentially been involved in that kind of disruption. And I'd like to see the Mueller investigation completed, take it to its conclusion. I doubt you're going to see something which implicates the president. I think that's very unlikely based on kind of the soundings that have been heard so far. But I do think we need to understand where Russia has been trying to play and to make sure they can't do so in the future.
On the domestic front, the House is set to vote this week on an immigration bill. Congress has tried over and over and over again to try to pass immigration legislation. It's been decades. Do you think this has become the third rail for Republicans, immigration?
Well, I think it's become a great source of economic success for the Democrats. They talk about bringing in place a new immigration policy.
Economic success for the Democrats?
Excuse me, political success for the Democrats. I think immigration is something they use to stimulate their base, to get people to turn out and to support them at the ballot box. But then they don't do anything about it. I mean, there was a time, as you may recall, when President Obama had a supermajority, both the House and the Senate. He could have passed immigration reform like he said he was going to in his first year, he promised, but he didn't.
It was true of George W. Bush, though, too. He wanted to do comprehensive immigration reform.
Yeah, and he put his bill forward. He worked on his bill, put it forward, fought for it, got turned down. All right, you can respect someone who fights for something, even if it gets turned down. President Obama had both chambers, supermajority, didn't do anything. Now, I happen to believe that there's goodwill in both parties, and that if we have some real leadership, and hopefully that comes from the White House, to say, look, let's get this part of it done, that we're going to be able to see something happen. If not, I'm going to keep fighting for it as one of those that really cares about this issue. It's just nuts to see what we've seen for all these years.
You support a pathway to citizenship for Dreamers?
I believe Dreamers ought to be able to get in line like everybody else, no special pathway. And I agree with what the president said early in the year, which is that Dreamers ought to be given given legal status until they work out what they want to do with regards to citizenship.
You mention goodwill. You say there's goodwill in both parties. The country has kind of been embroiled in this debate over civility and whether or not it's even possible in the climate that we're living in currently. Do you think civility is dead?
Well, I don't think it's dead. I think it's just not being practiced in many corners of Washington, D.C. I mean, you see in most state houses, people get along. Republicans and Democrats, whether it's a Republican governor or Democrat governor, people tend to get along. But in Washington, it's become extraordinarily divisive, and particularly what's covered in the news. Obviously, someone lights their hair on fire, that's what makes the news. But there are, of course...
Well, this past week it was children being separated from the border.
Well, that's, of course, that's something that's not just relating to civility. That's just humanity, basically.
But it's what sparked many of these altercations. Sarah Sanders being kicked out of a restaurant, Stephen Miller being confronted, etc.
Yeah, and I think we've, over our history, when people have felt that there's been a departure from what they consider to be moral conduct, they're going to stand up and make their position
so you
very,
think that's
very clear.
Okay?
Well, I think it's fine to express your viewpoint, and I'm not going to tell people what to do and what not do. But I would far prefer people going to public places, if you will, parks across from the White House, or parks, the mall across from the nation's capital, and gathering together and protesting. And that way, the message is heard loud and clear. But harassing people, I just don't think that's very effective. And frankly, as someone who hopes to go to Washington, I hope it doesn't catch on.
Final question, because I know we have to wrap it up. But you said recently that you voted for your wife, Ann Romney.
Highly qualified, capable person.
For president in 2016. Will you vote for President Trump in 2020? You said you think he's going to get reelected.
It's too early to say who I will support. Yeah, I did say I think he'll get reelected. That's not an endorsement. I mean, I also think that Gavin Newsom will get elected in California. That's not something I want to see. It's just something that's probably going to happen.
Do you want somebody to run against him, against President Trump?
It's not a question of want. There will be people who decide, I presume, to get in a Republican primary. I think the president's support among Republicans, what is it now, 90% approval, suggests he will be able to become the nominee relatively easily. And I think the Democrats are going to go further left. They're likely to nominate someone further from the mainstream of American thought. And in a setting like that, I think the president gets reelected.
But you're not yet willing to say that you'll vote for him?
I'm not willing to say who I'm going to support at this stage. That's a little early for that, but the time will come.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.